Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be hosting our workshop for What's My Lab Do with Professor Hoversten. I'm Palash, one of the lead peer advisors of the psych department, and we have Breeza as
Yeah, hi. So I'm Breeza. I'm one of the other lead peer advisors here, and we'll go ahead and get started in just a few minutes. But it's so nice but thank you for joining us.
okay, and now we can hand it off to Professor Hoversten.
If it lets me. But yeah, of course, Professor Hoverstein is is an assistant professor as well as a researcher here at UCSC. She tends to focus on cognitive science, psycholinguistics, bilingualism, multilingualism, and language processing. And we'll go ahead and hand it off to her, and she can give her a presentation on her work as well.
All right, can everybody hear me? I'm good. Okay. And I'm going to share my screen. And nope, it should not be doing that. There we go. Does that look right to everyone? Birsa and Palash, we're good? Okay. All right, so thank you for the nice introduction. I'm excited to be here and talk to you guys today about my lab and what we do in my lab, the type of research and everything. So as they said, my name is Liv Hoversten, and I'll give maybe a little bit of background on kind of my journey to being here, but then I'm going to focus most of the presentation on the research and the work that we do in my lab. So I actually majored in chemistry as an undergrad, and took a lot of biology classes as well. We didn't have a minor, but it was basically a biology minor. So I was really into chemistry and biology. I was into neuroscience and things like that. And I knew nothing about this type of research when I was an undergraduate. And so I took those classes, I got my degree and everything, and then I decided to join the US Peace Corps, which, if you haven't heard of it, is an organization that allows people to volunteer to live abroad somewhere for 2 years and do some sort of project. It can be community development projects. It can be teaching, different types of things. And you work really closely with people in that country. You learn their language, you're kind of integrated into the community, and kind of helping meet some sort of need of that community that they've actually invited Peace Corps volunteers in to meet some sort of need and help them grow and develop. So I was in Tanzania in East Africa, and I was a chemistry and biology teacher there for 2 years. So I learned Swahili, and I'm not very good at it anymore. It's drifted away. But I learned Swahili there, and did some teaching and things like that. And then when I came back to the US after my volunteering with the Peace Corps, I worked in a biomedical research lab for a while, and ended up deciding I like the idea of research, but I really don't like sitting in a corner by myself, putting chemicals together or squirting things in tubes and stuff like that. That just wasn't my thing. I wanted to work more with people, and do something else. And so I had learned Swahili as a child. I had learned Norwegian, I'd also traveled a little bit and explored learning Thai for a couple of months. So I'd kind of had some different language experiences and was really interested in that. And so I had this idea of what if we could do neuroscience and language, and specifically bilingualism or multilingualism. And I looked into it some more, and sure enough, there's an entire field of research that actually focuses on this and that does that. And so from there on, I pursued that path. I went to graduate school to get my PhD in this field, and I was at UC Davis. And then being a globetrotter and interested in languages, after I graduated with my PhD, I decided to go to Spain to do a postdoctoral fellowship, which is typical after you graduate with a PhD. You get a little bit more training for a few years in research. Maybe you expand, you get some new mentors and so forth. And I did that in the Basque Country in Spain, on the Spain side. And then I learned some Spanish and worked on that. I've been continuing to work on my Spanish from there. And then at that point, I got the job here and I moved here. I started at UCSC in 2020. So this is my 4th year at UCSC. Some of you might have also started in 2020 or during the pandemic and had that experience shared with me. So that brings me here. So that's kind of a little bit of my interest in the field and where I came from and how I got here. I'm happy to answer more questions about that in the Q&A period later. If you want to know more about my journey or about, I don't know, my thoughts on going to grad school or doing research or whatever you like. But from here, I'm going to start on my presentation on the lab itself and the research that I work on. So I'm the director of the Interpret Lab here at UCSC, and Interpret stands for the Interactive ERP Reading and Eye Tracking Lab. And you'll see that all of those things are incorporated into the research that we do. ERPs and eye tracking are the main methods we use. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what those are if you don't know a lot about it and how they can be applied to our research questions. We also study reading, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, as well as the whole idea of it being interactive, and interpret comes from this idea that we study bilingualism mainly. Okay, so psycholinguistics was mentioned in the introduction by our lovely peer advisors. What is psycholinguistics? Basically, this is a fancy term saying that we're combining language and cognition and studying the cognition of language or the psychology of language, hence psycho being psychology and linguistics from linguistics. So the cognition of language. So how does the brain support language processing? What's going on in the brain to allow us to speak to one another, to listen to each other and understand each other, to read, to write, and so on and so forth. Any of these things is all encompassed in this idea of psycholinguistics. It is like a scientific study of how the brain supports language, which is a very important thing because we speak and use language and read and write all the time in our daily lives. So it's really important to understand what's going on here. So that's a little background on psycholinguistics. And I teach an entire course on this if you're interested. Psychology of language is Psych 125, is about all sorts of different things going on with language and cognition. But my lab in particular studies bilingual language processing. And why is this so important? Well, for one, typically the research in psycholinguistics has focused a lot on monolingualism, on people who speak one language, on native speakers of a language, and kind of figuring out what's going on in the brain just to do language, a language, right? And historically, bilingualism was kind of thought as like this special case scenario. It's kind of the exception. So like some people study bilingualism, it's the special thing. But the majority of psycholinguistics just studies language. And by that, they meant a language, usually monolingualism. Okay, so that's kind of strange because if you can see in this picture here, this is a map of the world, as you can see, with lots of pretty colors all over it. And each of those colors denotes a different language family. Okay, not even a specific language, but a language family. So like if you've studied, say, Spanish before, Spanish is a Romance language. So you'll see Spanish, this is Spain here, and France and Italy, they're all colored in blue here, as is a lot of Latin America. Those are all Romance languages being spoken, okay? So they're kind of related to each other. So these are language families being plotted here. And even with that, you can see just how many places there are where there are lots of different languages being spoken and different language contact between these different language families. There are so many different languages in the world, and there are so many places where there are multiple languages spoken. And so even though in the US it's not as common, in California maybe a little bit more than the rest of the US, and it really depends on where you are and your background and everything. A lot of times in the US we kind of think of English as being the only language that's being spoken, which isn't true at all. But outside the US, there are countries, I think it's in India, there are like 500 some odd languages being spoken in India alone. And so there are lots of different reasons to be bilingual. There's so much language contact around the world. And there's so many different people who are bilingual or multilingual in the world. So as it turns out, it's actually more the norm than the exception to be bilingual or multilingual, to have at least two languages that you know well enough to communicate in both languages. And so this idea in psycholinguistics, the history of psycholinguistics, that we're just studying a language, actually really is kind of the special case, because the majority of people in the world actually have more than one language stored up here in the brain, and they're able to keep track of which language is which and use the appropriate one in the appropriate scenario, maybe switch between them and so forth. This is actually more common than the case of a lot of people in the US who just speak a language, being English, and maybe they've studied a little bit of another language for a year or two in high school, maybe a year in college, but they're not really comfortable using it. That's actually a really rare case worldwide. So it's really important to study bilingualism because it is such a common and important phenomenon worldwide. Okay, so not just bilingualism, multilingualism, but we're interested in how the brain works and how the brain keeps track of these different languages and is able to use more than one language. Okay, so I'm interested in questions like, how does the brain store and process more than one language? When you have to learn more than one language, how does that get represented in the brain? How do you store that information in your memory? And then when you're actually using language in your everyday scenario, how do you go in and access those representations so that you can pull out the right word and the right language when you're speaking or when you're listening to somebody else, so that you can find the right word in your memory and figure out what it is that they just said. What does it mean, right? We have to have something in our memory to be able to figure out what we're listening to and understand it, right? So I'm really interested in what is the brain doing to store those languages and to process that, and how do you juggle between two or more languages, okay? Some other questions I'm interested in addressing that we work on in my lab are things like, how does variation in language experience affect language processing? So all of you listening here today, you're going to have different experiences with language, different experiences with different languages. Maybe some of you speak languages other than English. Maybe you have a different native language that you spoke with your parents growing up before you learned English. Maybe you have studied another language in high school or in college for a little bit, and are just learning another language. There's all this variation in language experience, in the age that you start learning different languages, in how much exposure you have, how much usage, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in understanding how different individuals, these individual differences between people, come out, and how this variation affects language processing. I'm also very interested in how different types of contextual cues guide language processing. So in the case of bilingualism, you can imagine there are different people that you're going to have to use different languages with. So there might be some people that you use English with. For example, right now we're speaking English, and so you would know me as an English speaker. And so having had an experience with me as an English speaker, you see me again tomorrow, you're going to recognize, oh, this is an English speaker, we should speak English to each other. So that's a type of cue to tell you what language you should speak because you have some experience with that particular person. Or even educationally, maybe you're more used to speaking English at school, but you speak a different language at home. So when you go home, that context changes how you do language processing because now suddenly you need to be speaking this other language in this other context. So I'm really interested in how these different contexts guide our language processing. Okay. Another question that's a little more technical, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, but I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. But I mentioned that I study reading a lot. And what we want to figure, one of the main questions we want to figure out in my lab is how your attention is distributed across words during reading. So during reading, you have a whole text. You can't glance at it once and understand the whole thing. We actually have to move our eyes around in order to understand what we're reading, right? We have to see pretty much every word we have to look at specifically in order to read it. Okay, so what I'm interested in understanding is how do we guide our eye movements for efficient language processing? And how does language processing happen during reading? This idea of spatial attention is the idea of whether we're paying attention to one single word only, or whether we have multiple words that we're trying to process all at once. And that's a big question in the research. So I'm interested in working on that and figuring that out. And then another kind of related question is how the brain processes code switches between languages. So if you're going along in one language and then suddenly you switch and start to speak another language, how does the brain process that? How does the brain understand that the language has now switched and I need to be retrieving representations from memory in that other language? So those are some of the main questions that we work on in the lab. And kind of broadly speaking, this idea of storage and access to another language, this wasn't supposed to appear all at once. My animations got messed up, but that's okay. So one of the major things that we work on in the realm of bilingual language processing is this idea of whether we have what's called selective access or non-selective access. Selective access, you can kind of think of as the idea of being able to turn on and off your languages like a light switch, okay? So if I need to use, say, Spanish in a particular context, and I'm speaking with somebody else who only knows Spanish and they don't know English or any other language that I know, then the idea would be that I turn on my language switch for Spanish and I just turn off English, for example. Okay. And then I don't need to worry about English anymore. I just have this like light switch of, okay, Spanish is relevant. I'm going to activate my Spanish knowledge and I'm going to deactivate all my English knowledge so that it doesn't interfere. Okay, so it's like a light switch kind of mechanism here. The opposite side of the coin, or the other possibility, is this non-selective access idea. And I've represented it with this cat video with these fingers poking through, because this idea is that you can't really ever switch off a language. So even if I only need to be using one language and I shouldn't be using another language in a context, even then that other language is there and it's available, and it's going to kind of be poking up through the gaps. And what my brain has to do is continually suppress it, continually inhibit it, push it back down and say, no, 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 that's not the language we're using. You need to use this other language. Okay. So the idea of non-selective access is that you can't turn off a language. Both languages are going to be active and available at all times. And in order to use one of your languages, you basically have to continually suppress the other language. Okay, those representations will come up and you have to go, nope, not that one, this one. Okay. So these are kind of the two opposite sides of the coin, and prior research before I came into the picture, even in this field, has done a lot of work kind of debating about these two possibilities, figuring out which one is more representative of the reality of what's actually going on in the bilingual brain. And it turns out that a lot of research has kind of settled on this idea of non-selective access, that that's how it actually works. If any of you are bilingual, you might have had the experience of trying to speak in one language, and you're trying to think of a word in that language, and all you can think of is this word in the other language. And you just can't think of the right word in the language you're trying to speak. Okay, that's one of these ideas of that interference of the other language. And then it's kind of showing that maybe your brain is having some trouble suppressing it in order to select the correct language word, right? Figure out what the word is in the correct language, right? So it's evidence of these little fingers poking up and the cat just is having trouble pushing it back down. So there's evidence out there that, yes, there is some non-selective access going on. So this is probably, the field has kind of settled on this idea that this is how it works, okay? My research, on the other hand, kind of questions this whole paradigm, this dichotomy of this or this, selective or non-selective. And a lot of the data and the research that I've done has actually led me to propose this idea that maybe it's not one or the other, but it's somewhere in between. And it's something I have coined the term partially selective access to kind of show that it's a little bit more nuanced. It's actually more in between these two extreme options, okay? And the mechanism I like to think of as kind of a metaphor for this is kind of like turning radio dials or dials on, whatever equipment you have, okay? Where maybe you have two different dials for your two different languages, okay? And if you need to use one language but not the other, you're going to turn up the dial on that one and you're going to turn down the dial on the other one, okay? It's not a light switch where you're just turning one off and one on and one off, right? You're kind of tuning it to the context. And maybe you're not going to turn the other language all the way off. You're just kind of going to turn the volume down a little bit and turn the volume up on the other language so that you can mainly use that language. And this language isn't going to be like interfering constantly with what you're trying to do, okay? Then you might be in another scenario where you need both languages, okay? Maybe you're speaking with another bilingual and you want to switch back and forth between languages, and that's perfectly fine. There are lots of bilinguals who switch back and forth between languages, and it's relatively easy for them to do. And so maybe in that case, you're going to dial up the volume on both of your languages, and then they're both kind of available. And you can use both of them kind of interchangeably, and that works just fine. Okay. So there might be kind of more of this contextual, these contextual effects that change the activation state of your languages based on what's needed in a particular context. and that you might be able to kind of fine tune your two languages, your two language systems, so that you can kind of activate one more than the other or both of them. You can kind of do a little bit of deactivation, you can do a lot, and you can kind of really change this and fine tune it to whatever you need in a particular context or setting. Okay, so that's kind of the idea my research has led me to and to proposing. And then I do a lot of work testing this this model, this idea. Okay, so that's what we do in my lab, is a lot of work generally kind of testing this idea and specifying what's really going on. I can give you the metaphor that it's kind of like these dials, but we don't have dials in our brain, right? We have neurons. So how does that actually work in the brain? What is the brain doing? How is it accomplishing this task? And those are the questions we're interested in asking. Now, how do we actually go about testing these questions? We have two main methods in my lab that we use. And I referred to them briefly in the name of the lab, the Interpret Lab. We use mainly ERPs and eye tracking. And the reason why we need to use this is because language processing happens really, really fast, okay? Most people speak at a rate of about 4 to 5 words every second. So as you're listening to me right now, I don't know exactly what the rate I'm speaking at is, but as you're listening to me right now, your brain is processing, say, 5 words every single second, and you're understanding what I'm saying. Okay, you're understanding each of the words, you're putting together the sentences, you have an idea of what's going on in this presentation. And my brain is planning out what I'm going to say so that I can speak 5 words every single second. So my brain's doing a lot of work to plan that out and figure out what I'm going to say next, and then actually articulate it. So 5 words a second, that's about 200 milliseconds per word. And even if I were to slow down to 4 words per second or something, that's 250 milliseconds per word. Okay, so somewhere on the range of 200 to 250 milliseconds, okay, 1/5 to 1/4 of a second, is how fast the speaker has to plan out word by word, and how fast the listener on the other end has to be understanding each individual word. Okay, that's really, really fast. 250 milliseconds is really fast, okay? And a lot of things are happening during those 200 to 250 milliseconds to allow your brain to understand that individual word, right? You have to have your ears actually hear the sound waves. Then it has to transmit it into your brain, into something your brain can understand. Your brain has to like reassemble and figure out what are the sounds that you just heard. Then your brain has to go through all these processes to figure out, okay, what does that word mean? And then how does that word relate to the rest of the words that I just said? Okay, all of that has to happen in like 200 milliseconds, which is really fast. Okay, so we need measures and methods and measures that are really, really have fine-grained temporal resolution. Or in other words, we need methods that can tell us what's going on millisecond to millisecond to millisecond of exactly what's happening, even within the span of like 200 to 250 milliseconds while you're trying to understand one single word. Okay, we need to be able to break that apart to see what's your brain doing in order to understand that single individual word. Okay, so both of these methods have that property that they're really good at timing information, at helping us figure out what's going on at different times throughout that process, and how long does it take us to do different computations for the brain to figure out what's going on. Okay, both of these are on the order of somewhere between 10 and 20 milliseconds that you can actually statistically see a difference between conditions, say. Okay, we can measure every single millisecond. We can take a measurement in both of these methods. Every single millisecond we take a measure, but then when we do the statistical processing of the data, we could maybe find differences around the order of 10 milliseconds or so. 10 to 20 milliseconds is reasonable. Okay, so what are these methods? You may have heard of them before in different classes. I'll explain briefly. I should have shown you this already. I will explain briefly each of them individually. So EEG and ERP, I'll explain the difference between that. You may have heard both of these terms. This is the one where you have like the swimming cap kind of thing on your head. Maybe you've even participated in that kind of study. And there are little electrodes that you can see around the head. These are these little dots on the head, okay? And they're like little pieces of metal that are really, really sensitive to electrical activity. So neurons produce electrical activity as they're working, okay? And what you're doing is you're just recording all of the electrical activity that your brain is producing, and it's producing all that electrical activity, and it's coming out of your head, and we're just recording whatever we can find from outside the head. Okay, so you put on this little swimming cap with these electrodes, and then we record whatever we can. So there's really nothing invasive. We're not injecting signals or like, I don't know, doing anything like that here. We're just recording whatever electrical brainwave activity we can find, okay? And we end up with a signal that looks something like this down here. I'll explain more about this in a little bit here when I talk about these different methods. The other main method that we use in my lab is eye tracking, which just from the name, you can figure out what it is. So what we're doing is we're nowadays we use like a high-speed video camera and some specialized software to figure out where exactly somebody's eyes are looking on a screen during a particular task. So in our case, usually it's a reading task because we're interested in language processing. So you might have a sentence like this, and then you're looking at where people are looking in the sentence. What's the order of where they're looking from one word to the next? Sometimes you skip a word, sometimes you move back in the sentence. Sometimes you look at a word multiple times, and then you look at different words for different amounts of time. So we record all of that data, and then we figure out what was the brain doing in order to process this sentence based on where the eyes are looking. Okay, so that's the brief introduction. Getting into a little bit more depth and information about what eye tracking is. Eye tracking, in essence, is a measure of where and when the eyes move. So where are they looking, and how long are they looking? When are they moving to a different spot? Okay. And the whole idea of this is that where we're looking tells us something about where our attention is being directed. So if I'm looking at a particular word, that means that my brain is most likely processing that particular word. Okay. Even in like a scene, if we're looking around our environment, wherever I'm looking is often where my attention is directed. It's not an exactly relationship. It's better in reading than in scene perception. But I have a whole class on this if you want to take my eye tracking class to get into the details on that. But the basic idea is if we're looking somewhere, we're very likely paying attention to whatever is there in that visual environment. Okay, so we use that to infer what's going on in the brain. Okay, there are lots of different methods. So the really, really old school way over 100 years ago was they had these contacts with electrical coils in them that were able to measure where the eyes are moving. Sounds really uncomfortable and terrible, so we don't usually use that anymore. I've not heard of it actually. Then they progressed in like the 70s and 80s to big monster machines like this. This is the type of machine I was actually trained on, not in the 80s. more recently than that, but I lovingly named her Bertilda. And it's a complicated machine where you used to have this kind of bite bar that you put your mouth on to stabilize the head, and then there were all this equipment to be able to figure out where the eyes are moving. It's kind of a pain to use. And then more recently, we've moved to this type of system where you just have a really high-speed video camera that tracks where the eyes are moving. As technology gets better, we can do that. There are also these like head-mounted eye trackers, and even things like Google Glass or whatever it's called now. I don't know. It keeps changing, all of those things. But a lot of the virtual reality programs can have eye trackers as well, which are basically something along this line. It's good for kids because they move around a lot, and so the eye tracker moves with them, so that's helpful. So there are lots of different ways to measure where the eyes are looking at any given time. Oh, here we go. Here's a virtual reality thing. I don't think we'll have time to watch this video, so you'll have to take a class with me to find out more. There's a cool little demo though that you can find at reali.io. That's an online based eye tracker, which is becoming more popular and more used. They're not particularly accurate, I wouldn't say. I looked into using that during the pandemic and decided it just wasn't worth it. Because I need really accurate data, so I need the really fancy equipment to do it. But if you're interested in eye tracking, you can do a demo yourself at reali.io, and then it'll play back where your eyes were looking during the little 4 or 5 minute demo. It's kind of cool to do. Okay. So getting back to reading and eye movements and what we do in the lab, here is a figure of a little text that somebody can read. And there are all these dots on top of the text, and the dots tell us where the participant was looking while they were reading this particular text. Okay, so the center of the dot is exactly where the eye tracker measured they were looking. And then the size of the dot scales with how long they were looking there. So a really small dot is they were only looking there for a short period of time. A big dot means they looked at that word for a long period of time. And then the lines between them indicate kind of the trajectory of where they were moving. So they might get to the end of a line and then you move on to the beginning of the next line. So there's a nice big return sweep saccade there, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of what the data look like when we get that data. And like I explained before, eye movements we know are directly related to cognitive processing. So we move our eyes to where our attention is directed, or in other words, wherever our eyes are looking is often usually where our attention is for the amount of time that it takes us to process that particular word. So how do we know this? Well, easier words are much more likely to be skipped. So you can see in these, in this little example here, words like is, it, let's see, also, them, with, to, for. These are words that are more likely to be skipped, okay? Because they're just easier to process. They're short, they're easy, they're really frequent, and so forth. Easier words are also more likely to have shorter fixation times. So even though this time the word the before the beach was fixated or looked at, it's for a short period of time. It's a little dot, right? So easier words are either skipped or looked at for short periods of time. And that tells us that there's a real direct relationship between these eye movements and cognitive processing, what's going on. So in my lab, we do things like give people a sentence and record how long it takes them to look at a particular word in that sentence. And then we might compare it to a different sentence that, well, it's the same sentence, except that I replaced the word boss in this sentence with the Spanish translation, which is cafe. Okay, so basically I've switched the language. There's a code switch inside the sentence, and we can look at how long people look at that switched word compared to when it's not switched, when it's in the same language as the rest of the sentence. And sure enough, as it turns out, bilinguals tend to look at a switched word like this for a longer period of time than when it's not switched to the other language. And from that, we kind of conclude that it takes you longer to process a word when it's switched to the other language than when it's in the same language as the rest of the sentence. Okay. So we can do this kind of manipulation here to figure out what's going on. Then we can change the manipulations, we can make it more complicated, we can switch multiple words in the sentence, we can have sentences that just switch back and forth. We can see how that context, those different factors, change how these words are processed. Okay. And so we have these different conditions that we can figure out what the brain is doing while we're reading these sentences. Okay. Now we get to the other method, and we're gonna talk about this method, and then I'm gonna be done and have time for questions. So we're actually almost to the end here. But I'll explain a little bit about what EEG and ERPs are, if you haven't heard of this. So I talked about this like electrodes in the little swimming cap, kind of stretchy cap kind of thing, and the electrodes, and then the wires coming out and they connect to the computer, right? And here's another diagram of me, yours truly, participating back in grad school in an EEG experiment here. So this technique is called electrophysiology, or EEG for short. Okay. And what you do is you prepare the electrodes in the cap. You have to kind of put some gel in there and scoot it around to get a good connection so that you can record the brain waves, because brain waves, it turns out, are really, really, really tiny. And so you have to get a really good connection there. And then you record that electrical signal from the brain from these electrodes. And then you send it to a computer. The signal, those little brain waves, they're so tiny, they have to be amplified or made bigger, okay, and digitized so that they can be stored on a computer, and then we can analyze the data. And this is what it looks like when it comes out, okay? So each of these lines is a different electrode on the head. And then this is the voltage or the electrical activity over time. Okay, so time goes along the x-axis horizontally here. Over time, those brain waves change, okay? And they're related across different electrodes, okay? But it is different. You record different signals throughout the head, which is why we have electrodes all over the head, because it looks a little different throughout the head. So this is the data that we actually record directly from the scalp, from these electrodes. Okay, what are ERPs? ERPs stand for event-related potentials, okay? Ignore this little animation, it messed up a little bit. So we take this signal that we recorded, okay? And you can see these little green lines going across, okay? Those are little tags saying a word appeared here. Okay, and it's got a number associated with it so that we can figure out what word it was. Okay, so it says exactly at this time there was a word on the screen. Okay, so we can look at the electrical activity in the brain related to the processing of a particular word or a particular event. Hence, it's event related. Okay. So what we do is we have this whole signal going across. This is just, say, one electrode, okay? And what we do is we have these times when a word appeared, for example, okay? And you can kind of take out little chunks of data saying the word appeared at this time. I want to see what happened in the 1 second time period after that word appeared. So I'm going to pull out that 1 second chunk. Okay, and I'm going to do that for all the different words that appeared on the screen. Okay, so this chunk, this chunk, this chunk, many, many, many words. Okay, so it's time locked to when the word started. That's the 0 point here. And then what we do is we average all of these together, okay, to get rid of all that crazy noise, because I can't really tell what's going on here. So we average a bunch of things together in the same condition, and we get what's called an event-related potential, or an ERP, okay? I'll explain this in a minute. So here's what those ERPs look like when you average things together in different conditions. So in this figure on the right here, okay, we have a blue squiggle line and we have a black squiggle line. The blue squiggle line represents all the words averaged together that were in one particular condition, okay? And the black squiggle line is all the words together that were in the other condition, okay? And it always starts, this vertical line here, the 0, okay, starts at when the word appeared. So it's overlapping all those different words, starting from when the word appeared, okay? And then we can look at 2 different conditions and what did the brain do for this particular type of word versus this particular type of word, okay? What was happening there? So the example of a type of task that we might do or experiment we do in our lab is we might say, we're gonna show you lots of different words, okay? And what I want you to do is I want you to press a button every time you see an English word. Okay, so that's going to be our target language is English. But if you see a Spanish word, I don't want you to press the button at all. Okay, only press a button when you see English words. Okay, so that creates a target language, one you're supposed to be paying attention to, and a non-target language, one that you should ignore. Okay. And then when you press the button, which button are you going to press? Well, you're going to press with your left hand if it's a living thing, so like girl. And I want you to press with your right hand if it's a non-living thing like coin. Okay. So we set up this task that participants do. We record the EEG signal. We pull out the chunks of data related to each word that appeared. And then we average all the words in each condition together, okay, to create the ERPs. And at the end, we get this nice, beautiful squiggles, one black squiggle for all the words that appeared in the target language. So these are the words they're supposed to pay attention to and press buttons. And all the words in the non-target language, these are the words they're supposed to ignore, don't press a button, okay? And sure enough, you can see there's a difference between them. The brain did something differently to process the target versus the non-target language. And it turns out the processing is stronger in the target language than in the non-target language, okay? It's not completely gone in the non-target language, but it's smaller, okay? If I'm not supposed to pay attention to words in that language, my brain is gonna kind of suppress that language and not process it as much. Okay, so this is the type of thing, the type of data we use to support this idea of partially selective access that I introduced earlier. This dialing up and down. So in this particular case, you're told to pay attention to one language, you got to dial up that language, and you're told to ignore the other language, you better dial it down. Okay, it's not switched off completely, but it's dialed down. Okay. So this is just a brief introduction. Hopefully you followed along with most of it to some work in my lab that we're working on. There are lots of different projects, but these are some basic ideas about what we do in my research and in my lab. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and to all of my mentors and collaborators and grad students and research assistants who work with me on this research. So thank you, and I'd welcome your questions.
Thank you, Professor Hoversten. That was really good. Now we're going to be taking some Q&A from everyone. So if anyone would like to ask a question.
Yeah, and then we actually have some like real quick questions for you as well. Okay, there we go. But yeah, we have some pretty basic questions, more like just research lab based, and you can kind of answer them however you see fit. But basically, what is research like day to day? How does that evolve or change from undergrad to graduate to your position now? And then what is a piece of advice for someone who is unsure if they are qualified to apply for research? And then just what is your favorite part of research?
These are great questions. I love it. So what is research like day to day? You're absolutely right. It evolves a lot in different phases of a career. So in undergrad, a lot of it is really hands-on. In my lab, you're working with participants, human participants. You learn to collect data. So you learn how to use eye tracking and ERP. Technology, the actual systems to collect the data. And we also do lab meeting every week where we talk about kind of the theory behind what are the projects that we're doing, the techniques that we're using, how they work, and so forth. So you're doing a lot of that hands-on learning of like, how does that actually work? You might also do some data analysis. You might do some programming to create the experiments. You might work on creating stimuli. So coming up with sentences to use in an experiment, things like that. Then in graduate school, you kind of build on that and you go deeper, okay? You really have to learn a lot about exactly how things work. And you start to learn how to come up with questions of your own, research questions of your own, and actually implement a research study by yourself with support of a mentor, of course. But you learn how to become more independent over time to figure out how are you going to generate new knowledge. That's the whole goal in the end, is you're being trained in how to do that. And so you do a lot of reading of research papers of other work that other people have done in different labs to try to figure out, okay, what do we already know? And then you start to practice skills in figuring out, okay, if we know this, maybe there's a gap in the knowledge. Maybe we need to find out more about something. And you pinpoint that question. And you learn how to come up with an experiment that can test that and answer your question. And then you go through and you implement it. And you learn how to write your own research paper to publish and let other people read what you did. So that's the process in grad school that you're doing. And then once you go beyond grad school, now here I am, I'm the PI of the lab. I'm in charge of this research operation. I've got lots of different projects going on, different experiments, different research questions. I'm in charge of training graduate students and helping them through this process, as well as I have lots of undergraduates working in the lab. So I interact with them a little bit as well. And guiding them towards, whatever career they want to do. And if they want to do research, I can help a little bit more because I know more about it, and so forth. But I'm really kind of the big picture person of thinking about what is the research program of the lab? What questions are we seeking to answer, and how are we going to go about doing that? So I get to do a lot of thinking about theory, about bilingual brains, about what do we know, what do we don't know, what am I curious about that I want to find more out about. I get to come up with experiments and then either do them myself or give them to other people to work on. So I get to do that big picture thinking, which I think answers the third question too, of that's my favorite part of research, is I love doing this like big picture thinking, and then I look at the data and go, okay, what does it mean? What does it tell us? How do we interpret this, and how do we figure out what the next step is? That's what I love about the research the most, and that's what I get to do the most in this position. There's a lot of administrative stuff too, maybe not my favorite part, but the big picture thinking is really exciting. Yeah, that's what I would
Thank
say.
you. And we actually do have a question of how did you become fascinated by psycholingual?
How did I become fascinated with this? I think I was always like really fascinated by language, and that those experiences that I talked about in the beginning of learning different languages, sparked my interest in now, how is the brain even doing this to figure out, like, there are two words for the same thing? How do I know which one to use in a scenario, for example? And even like I had a particular experience where I came back from Tanzania and I'd been speaking Swahili a lot for 2 years and I got pretty good at it. But prior to that, I knew Norwegian decently well. So I came back to the US and I tried to speak Norwegian and I hadn't spoken Norwegian for a couple of years. And all of a sudden I couldn't speak it anymore. All I wanted to do was speak Swahili. It was just like, that's the only thing that'll come out of my mouth. And I thought, oh my gosh, what happened to me? Like, what's going on in my brain here? And why can I not figure out which language is which and like how to control which one I'm supposed to be speaking? Where did it go? And that really, that experience alone, I would say, is like the single moment that I really thought, I gotta figure this out. I gotta do something about this. So hopefully that helps. Applying to
Oh, we
the
actually,
lab. Saw that chat. Oh dear. Okay, my screen just got crazy. Okay, how do you go about applying to my lab in particular? Send me an email and I can direct you to an application. We have like a Google form application for the lab. And we review them kind of quarterly to figure out who's the best fit for joining the lab.
well, if we don't have any more questions, Professor Hoversten, I'd like to thank you for your time and thank you for the great presentation. It was definitely extremely informative.
Great, thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending as well.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for attending. Feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. Just shoot me an email. Or
Yeah.
yeah, we can come up with a Zoom time or come to my office or something as well.
Yeah, and I'll just leave off with one more note about where to find these research opportunities that we offer. We do have a bulletin board posted on the second floor of social sciences that you're welcome to check out, as well as you're welcome to check online on our psychology page. And then these will show all the current positions that are available. But of course, you're always welcome to reach out, especially to Professor Hoverstein for any other information.
Excellent.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Thank you for setting it up, Risa and Palash. Wonderful job.
Yeah, thank you. I really liked your presentation. It was very interesting.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully it wasn't too
Thank
much. TMI.
No, not at all. I found it extremely interesting.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I actually did have a question myself, if you don't mind me asking.
Sure.
Out of curiosity, do accents and dialects affect bilingualism, or are they factors in it?
It's a good question. I don't do a lot of work on accents, but I actually do have one project that we're starting to foray into accent
Okay.
processing and how that works. There's a whole big thing on that. I actually saw
Yeah.
some research recently comparing like switching between languages to switching between accents.
Okay.
And how actually there is kind of a cognitive processing cost if you start listening suddenly to a new accent. Even just like
Okay.
going from one speaker to the next can have a little bit of processing cost. Your brain has to kind of reset to get used
Yeah,
to
jump to
anything.
it.
But it's even a
Yeah.
little bit bigger when it's a new accent. And that research group is actually trying to figure out why and what's going on. How does your brain
Okay.
like calibrate itself to the new
Yeah.
accent to be able to understand it? You might have had that
Yeah.
experience when you listen to somebody and it's an
Yeah, I
accent
was
that
actually
maybe you're not
we had some
familiar with.
questions.
Yeah,
Yeah, we had some
exactly.
questions typed out, and I was genuinely curious
Yeah,
about that one.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't totally
Yeah.
know yet, but working
Okay.
on it. Good
Awesome.
question.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the presentation, and we hope you have a great day.
You're welcome. Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Okay, see you around. Bye-bye.